Let's go. Seem to be working, seem to be working. Let's go fucking see. For you to be working right. So, ba ba ba. And then we would go ba ba ba. And we would go over here with this screen. I let this run off. I don't know why. Like right in the middle of my fucking session. Goddamn. Cut out and I'll miss it. You appear to be offline. Yeah, no, I'm not though. I'm not offline though. You say that I'm offline, but oh, maybe I am offline. Wait, what? No, no. Yeah, like what? I'm not offline, no. Okay, so much better. But, you know, okay. There we go. Much better. Okay, so now I am trying to load BNet, and then I've got Twitch across my board, and then I've got that and that and that and that and that. And then, okay, good. Oh, Tuesday, yeah, Tuesday. So play. Sunday play. I gotta go early today. Gotta go bed early today. I got a doctor's thing tomorrow, like fairly early. God damn it, I don't want to do that. What is it? Why are you telling us on Sunday that there'll be a maintenance on Tuesday? I mean, I guess it makes sense, but yeah. I love my evoker. Oh yeah, I was doing fun stuff. That's right. Cool. Fun stuff. Yeah. Fun stuff's good. Although I want to go, before I do this, you gave me a Hearthstone to this, right? I mean, I don't know. They would do this, but your computer. These weren't as fun. Yes. So what are you like XP? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, just 100%. I don't need those. But I mean, they'll vendor for 5, so I'll take the 5 gold. It's like free gold, yeah. In progress, right? These are 30-minute ones. Yeah, that's fine. Give me.
Me got the good stuff, man.
And then we got what? And then over here we have, you can please color rewards you would contribute to the ambitious, and I have 5 rewards at the sanctum. Do I have my? Oh, I do. Yay, my 3rd garrison Hearthstone, right? And then I need, eventually I'll work on the mage tower, right? Oh yeah.
How goes the fight?
Wolves. I don't really want to do that, but I do.
Sug.
Want to learn, not rush orders, but scouting missives. Oh yeah, to the activity in blah blah. But I'm looking for, not rush orders, but the.
Go forth to victory.
Where's Gazlo at? There he is.
What crew standing by?
Better. Ashram appears. Use the guard to set your town hall up and gears to the tier 2.
I'm on it. I love it.
Yeah, something about Ashran. But, oh, well, that's okay. Available. But to do a cipher, I was good. Speak with bronze. So what do? I go like, oh, speak with bronze. Travel to. No. Oh, yeah. Let me get that. Yep. Garrison resources, and then. You want me to go places, but I don't think I want to. Don't believe I want to. So, you want to upgrade your garrison to tier 2. That's right there. Ah, there it is. Yes. So, Great Hall upgrades tier 2. None of the materials. So I need 200 more garrison resources, huh? And I can. I have a barracks down, which is this one. Yeah, it is this one. Yeah, and the mission specialist is this. Wait, is that the garrison? No, the one over east. That's the barracks. I think. Yeah. So now we have a barracks, right? And in the barracks is this guy who will
Greetings, man. Be seeing ya.
sell me things to miniaturize my bodyguards, but I don't really. I mean, what's well, reagents and stuff. Yeah, but blueprint spender. Yeah, blueprint spender, huh?
Hey, how you doing?
Nothing, huh? Alright, well.
What brings you here?
Spies of Iraq, Oshman. Savante.
What you need? Yeah, I'll take care of it. Jeez. Right away. I'm all yours, Commander.
Strength and honor.
What you looking for? You be careful, man.
I hate this space marine shit. Okay, so we're well, at least we seem to be running. Like, I don't know why I had a catastrophic breakdown last time, but I did. And we seem to be running, which is good. Yay for running. I don't know why I wasn't running, you know. I just look over and, hey, Streamlabs is taking a shit and Twitch is offline and both your devices aren't telling you, and, you know, your screen on your webcam's frozen and all this other shit. And I'm like, oh, cool, catastrophic stopping. That's cool. It's great. Hey, thanks. That's great for my career. Thanks for that, you know. Keep at it, you know. Really fun. This is a history, but we were listening to
experience. The furnaces were placed in the center of the ship, and so the only cooler section was the conning tower. But there, living conditions were scarcely better. The K-class was designed to sit high in the water, and when the ship rocked, even those with strong stomachs grew seasick while swaying high in the tower due to its irregular rhythm. Getting up to the conning tower, however, posed its own danger, as when water splashed down onto the control panels, it would ground them and cause the latter to shock anyone who touched it. Typically, to escape the uncomfortable accommodations of submarines, crews would be permitted to rest and live on depot ships while at port, but for those aboard the K-class, no such accommodations were made, as the K-class was designated a self-contained warship. This compounded with the reputation of the K-class for killing its crews, and in response to this stress, the men assigned to these ships regularly became violent with one another, and most turned to alcohol. What's more, the submariners were usually listless and bored, as the vast majority of their time was spent moored. They would occasionally scout for U-boats off of the coast of the British Isles, but in only one instance did a K-class engage an enemy submarine, where she managed to strike her target with a dud torpedo. Despite all of its shortcomings and its litany of failures, the Admiralty was still intent on seeing the K-class submarines used to their fullest potential, and the price of this self-assuredness would be paid not by those in command, but by those serving aboard the vessels themselves. On the evening of January 31st, 1918, a fleet of British ships left the port of Rosyth on the east coast of Britain. That night's goal was simple. The force was to travel through the Firth of Forth into the North Sea. Then, when they had passed north of the Isle of May, they were to change direction and proceed to a predetermined point where they would meet with another force traveling from Scapa Flow to participate in an exercise. Among these ships were 9 K-class submarines, and by now, each sailor aboard them had come to fear their vessel as much as any enemy's, perhaps more. All of the sailors were nervous. Earlier that afternoon, a pilot in a scout plane had spotted a submarine, but before he could approach, the submarine performed a crash dive and disappeared. Out in the open water, the fleet would be a vulnerable target for a German U-boat, and so extra precautions would be necessary. But there was another cause for the sailors' concern. Of the K-class submarines joining the fleet, one of them was of particular note, K-22. By now, many of the sailors knew that K-22 was not her original designation. She had formerly been known by the particularly unlucky name K-13. What's more, almost a year prior to the day, K-13 had catastrophically failed her trial run and foundered, killing nearly half of her crew. Those who survived were carved out of the hull only barely before they suffocated, and the ship was refitted and rechristened as K-22. According to naval superstition, a rechristened ship can only be unluckier than it once was. As if to make matters worse, the ship was assigned to the 13th Submarine Flotilla. To the crew, a ship rechristened from K-13 traveling with the 13th Submarine Flotilla on the anniversary of her fatal accident felt like tempting fate. The force from Rosyth was divided into 5 groups traveling in one long single-file line stretching for over 15 nautical miles, with each group leaving approximately 15 minutes after the one ahead of it. Out ahead, the flagship Courageous led the way on her own. Close behind was the 13th Submarine Flotilla, led by the Marksman-class flotilla leader Ethereal, which was to command and coordinate the 5 K-class submarines behind her. K-11, K-17, K-14, K-12, and finally, the rechristened K-22. Behind them, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron followed, consisting of 4 large cruisers, the Australia, the New Zealand, the Indomitable, and the Inflexible. These ships were flanked by smaller destroyers on either side in loose formation. Destroyers typically sat much higher in the water than the other larger surface ships, making them safer from enemy torpedo fire, and so they were often used to screen for enemy U-boats and act as an initial defensive line for cruisers and battleships. Following the cruisers was the 12th Submarine Flotilla, led by the scout cruiser Fearless, which had been retrofitted into a submarine tender for the 4 K-class submarines under her command: K-4, K-3, K-6, and K-7. The Fearless was of particular note due to her dazzle camouflage, an experiment designed to make it more difficult for enemy ships to gauge her distance. Finally, there were 3 massive battleships from the 5th Battle Squadron: the Barham, the Warspite, and the Valiant, with yet more screening destroyers assigned to their defense. In total, besides the destroyers, there were 19 ships leaving the port of Rosyth that evening as the sun
19.
set.
God damn, man.
In the dark, it would be impossible for each ship to directly follow the one ahead of it without assistance, and so each shone a blue stern light behind it as they left. These lights were only shown at half luminosity and shuttered so that they could only be seen within a narrow angle behind the ship, meaning that it would be easy to lose sight of this light. The difficulty was heightened as a mist settled onto the waters around May Island, reducing visibility. Reacting to the U-boat sighting earlier that day, the commander of the force had ordered all ships
This is
to
gonna be
increase
horrible.
speed to 21 knots when entering the open
Haven't seen this
ocean
one.
in order to pass through the threatened area as quickly as possible.
Oh, no.
But shortly after passing the Isle of May, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, K-11, noticed two small ships in the mist ahead of it. This was curious, as the Ethereal had given no warning, and nobody had been informed of any other ships scheduled to enter the waters around the island. To the captain of K-11,
Keep
it was
your
as if they
weapons
had
sharp
materialized
and your
out of the
senses
mist.
sharper.
Despite the poor visibility and the poor maneuverability of the submarine, K-11 was able to make a wide turn to avoid the vessels easily. K-17, close behind it, noticed the maneuver and made the same wide turn to avoid an impact. K-14, however, hesitated, uncertain of why they were making an unscheduled change of course, and the captain ordered to slow the ship from 19 knots to 13 in case of an obstacle. Suddenly, he saw the two ships in the mist and ordered a hard turn to port. The helm responded, and K-14 swung clear of the ships, but as the helmsman was rotating the wheel, it jammed. The submarine's current trajectory would take her well clear of the two unknown vessels, but the helmsman was no longer in control of the rudder, and the ship was stuck turning left. The captain turned on the navigation lights and called to halt the ship as the helmsman fruitlessly attempted to free the wheel. He pushed as hard as he could, but no matter how much pressure he applied, the wheel would not move beyond 3 inches in either direction, and all the while, the ship coasted through the water, the steam engine fighting against the massive momentum of the submarine. At last, K-14 came to a stop. Time was crucial, as the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was sure to be close behind, and if K-14 did not move, they ran the risk of being rammed by one of their number. More immediately, however, was the fear of the submarine just behind them, K-12, of inadvertently hitting them. Fortunately, K-12 also illuminated her navigation lights, and it was obvious that she would pass well clear of them. Assuming that K-22 would be following K-12, the captain busied himself with how he would clear K-14 of the battlecruisers closing on their position. 5 minutes later, as he ordered the ship ahead, the helm came free and the rudder would turn again, apparently with full control. The captain belayed his previous order and quickly decided that he would attempt to fall back in line with the rest of the submarines in the flotilla. However, one of his assumptions had proven wrong. The unlucky K-22 had been the last submarine in the line, but 5 minutes prior, their lookout had lost sight of K-12 and her stern light. K-22 had continued ahead at 19 knots in order to rediscover K-12, but had drifted far to port, and now she was on a direct course to ram K-14. Through the mist, K-22 spotted the red navigation light of K-14, and the captain ordered a hard turn to port. But the submarine was far too heavy and clumsy to make such a drastic turn. The bow of K-22 sliced into the nose of K-14,
Oh, no.
reaching the crew compartment, where 2 submariners were resting. Freezing water rushed into the submarine and caught these 2 men unaware, and they were quickly sucked out into the sea and drowned as a chunk of the bow from K-14 tore free and sank. Aboard K-22, the torpedo room was breached and water began rushing into it, but the crew was able to shut the watertight door and prevent the submarine from flooding. The same occurred aboard K-14. Everyone aboard each ship was confused. The captain of K-14 was baffled as to how he had been hit when his navigation lights made him so obvious in the water, while the captain of K-22 erroneously believed that he had hit K-12, the ship he was supposed to be following. In reality, K-12 had caught up with the ship ahead of it, mistaking K-17 for K-14, and was now following the undamaged members of the 13th Submarine Flotilla out into the North Sea, none of them aware of the collision. It was quickly established that the bow of K-22 was now lodged deep into K-14, but neither ship was in immediate danger of sinking. Knowing that the second battlecruiser squadron was on its way, a submariner exited the top of K-14 and began firing flares into the air in order to warn off any other ships, while another crew member requested assistance in Morse code with a lantern. And aboard K-22, the radio operator coded a message to the Ethereal to inform them of the collision. However, this message incorrectly stated that they had hit K-12, not K-14. And even then, it would take time for the message to be decoded. Before anything else could be done, the two ships would have to extricate K-22 from the hull of K-14. To this end, K-22 set her engines in reverse, and the ship carefully slid her nose out of the hull of K-14 with surprising ease. Soon, K-22 was facing directly eastward. But this had taken time, and soon after K-22 had settled in the water again, the massive Australia, leading the second battlecruiser squadron, passed K-22 on the port side, and close behind her were the New Zealand and the Indomitable. These three battlecruisers had fortunately chosen courses that took them around the submarines, only sloshing the barely buoyant ships in the water. But unbeknownst to anyone else, the final ship in the second battlecruiser squadron, the Inflexible, had some time prior lost sight of the ship ahead of it in the mist and had drifted significantly off course. Hoping to gain on them again, the captain ordered the speed increased, but only a few moments after he gave the order, he saw the starboard side of K-22, motionless and damaged in the water. Desperately, he gave the order to turn to starboard. The turn made the angle shallower, but it was far too late to prevent an impact. The bow of the Inflexible scraped along the starboard side of K-22, shearing off the external ballasts and the oil tanks before steaming past. Enraged, the captain of K-22 climbed out of the conning tower, shook his fist, and shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" Ignoring the question, the Inflexible continued on insouciantly and disappeared into the mist. It quickly became clear that none of the second battlecruiser squadron would be stopping to assist or assess the damage, leaving the two submarines to fend for themselves for the time being. In order to stay buoyant, K-22 emptied fuel and water from its tanks, coating the surface of the sea in a thin oil. Meanwhile, the Ethereal had finally managed to decode the distress call sent from K-22. At some point while relaying the message, someone had made a serious error, and it wasn't until almost 30 minutes later that the captain of the Ethereal learned of the first collision, after they had traveled 20 nautical miles away from the wreck. Acting quickly, the Ethereal made the decision to turn around and offer assistance. The captain was aware that this would potentially take the 13th Submarine Flotilla on a direct course towards the other ships exiting the Firth of Forth, and so he decided to make an extremely wide turn to starboard, surmising that if the turn was wide enough, they would pass the other ships far to the south. To reduce confusion, the Ethereal ordered the submarines to turn off their navigation lights, and out of an abundance of caution, the captain ordered a message sent to the other ships to inform them of this maneuver. However, the orders given to each group left an ambiguity. While they were to turn upon passing the Isle of May, no specific location was designated to begin this maneuver, and so each group turned at slightly different points, meaning that they were all now heading along slightly different tracks, and now the 13th Submarine Flotilla was headed directly towards the second battlecruiser squadron. Ideally, the second battlecruiser squadron would know to look for them, but despite the Ethereal's prudence, the battlecruisers were entirely unaware of the approach of the flotilla. The coding officer had been handed the message, but after he had finished coding it, he was given an addendum, and he was forced to code this as well. While he was coding this message, the cipher officer approached him and told him that the message should be sent in cipher, not code, and took both messages away to the bridge. For 30 minutes, the 13th Submarine Flotilla and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron steamed towards each other as the messages aboard the Ethereal were shuffled, amended, recoded, and reciphered. The warning was no closer to being transmitted by the time they were upon one another. The Australia, the New Zealand, and the Indomitable were all on a collision course towards the Ethereal. The Inflexible, which had ripped the ballast and fuel tanks off of K-22, was nowhere to be found. The mist gave the Ethereal little time for evasive maneuvers. She desperately turned to starboard to avoid the line of battle cruisers, and behind her, K-11 followed. The Australia, believing that the danger had passed, carried on her course. But at the last second, they saw that 2 more submarines, K-17 and K-12, were headed towards them. Any maneuver that the Australia made, however, would only put the submarines into further danger, as her stern would swing wide to hit the last submarine. Therefore, it was left to the clumsy K-class submarines to evade the Australia on their own. Each of them turned hard to starboard to follow the Ethereal and her maneuver. K-17 was able to make her turn just in time, but K-12 drew right up alongside the cruiser. With only feet to spare, K-12 passed clear of the Australia. However, this maneuver placed the remainder of the 13th Submarine Flotilla into further danger. While the battle cruisers had been evaded, there was still the matter of the screening destroyers concealed in the mist. Precisely how many there were, not even all of the captains knew. The Ethereal's turn had unknowingly placed her on a collision course directly with the destroyer, and seeing her with only seconds to spare, the Ethereal swung back to starboard to avoid her, then corrected her course to carry her southwest once again to take her out of the swarm of destroyers. As she did so, another screening destroyer placed herself in the way of the Ethereal, and again, the captain ordered a hard turn to starboard. The angle and the speed seemed far too much this time for those above deck, and they braced for impact. But miraculously, the Ethereal steered out of the way, and she once again continued leading the 13th Submarine Flotilla through the mist. At last, they had cleared the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron and its destroyers. But the 13th Submarine Flotilla was far from safe. The 12th Submarine Flotilla had made its turn much earlier than the other groups, and now the 2 flotillas were traveling at a shallow angle towards each other, the 12th traveling east and the 13th traveling southwest. The captain of the Ethereal believed that the 12th Submarine Flotilla would be aware of their presence, but the message had still not been delivered, meaning that the Fearless didn't know to look for the Ethereal or her submarines. As they approached, both submarine leaders saw that the 2 lines of ships would cross paths, but here the mist was lighter, and they were able to see one another with generous time to make a proper maneuver. It was clear that the Ethereal would easily pass the Fearless, but the present course could not be maintained if the K-class submarines were to avoid the Fearless and each other. Movement among naval vessels is governed by a set of rules, and one of these rules is that smaller ships are to turn to make way for larger ones, and between the Fearless and the K-class, the Fearless was the larger. Therefore, the captain of the Fearless ordered to maintain the present course. According to the rules of the sea, the K-class submarines would have to turn to starboard to make way for the Fearless and fall back in line with the Ethereal soon after. Given that there were no screening destroyers for the flotillas, this theoretically wouldn't pose a problem. However, the K-class submarines had no intention of changing course. K-11, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, passed in front of the Fearless, closer than was comfortable. The Fearless, however, continued onward. Now, K-17 was approaching. The Fearless waited to see K-17 turn as the two drew close, refusing to alter her heading out of fear of causing even further problems by encroaching on the submarine's responsibility. The Fearless waited until a collision became inevitable. In an effort to make the angle shallower, the Fearless began to turn, but it was far too late. As sirens blared, the bow of the Fearless struck the side of K-17 and lodged into her, dragging her forward with her massive momentum. Pulled by the water, K-17 rolled off to the port side of the Fearless and tore free. For the moment,
you guys
the
relate
Fearless
with the
appeared
warning
to still
message,
be buoyant,
I guess.
but it was immediately obvious that K-17
This kind of
was
disaster.
hopelessly damaged.
Oh,
While the
yes.
lurch was brutal for both ships, nobody was fatally injured,
the stuff
and the
about humanity that
56
makes
men
me
aboard
worried. To be on
K-17
those
began
ships,
clamoring to
to
the
be
top
part of
deck
life, to do
as the
anything,
boats
because
from the Fearless were
they
lowered
bungle
to
it.
ferry
They
the
bungle
submariners
everything.
to
They
safety.
bungle everything they
To
try to
warn
do.
her attendant submarines, the Fearless
Magnetic
began
has
blasting a
nature.
signal over the foghorn, indicating that the ship was coming to a stop. Behind it, K-4 heard the warning alarm and set her engines into full reverse, bringing her to a halt just barely in time before hitting the Fearless. Meanwhile, K-12 from the 13th Submarine Flotilla was approaching the damaged ships at a rapid pace. She made a sharp turn to starboard to avoid the Fearless and K-17, which now rested in her way, and she was just barely able to clear both damaged ships and careen past the 12th Submarine Flotilla. Behind K-4, K-3 was closing distance. The captain was called to the bridge during his dinner, but when he arrived, he was uncertain of what precisely was happening ahead of him, with a cacophony of sirens and mess of lights. He ordered the engines to half steam as he attempted to evaluate the situation, but as K-3 neared the ships, he recognized that he was on a collision course with K-4, and what's more, he would not be able to stop his massive submarine in time with the distance remaining. The helm oversteered K-3 to port, swinging the whole ship and trying to push her momentum to the port side of K-4. Now, however, the stern of the submarine was on track to hit K-4. Deftly, the helm turned K-3 back to starboard, swinging the stern out of the way just barely in time. Ordering the engines astern full, the submarine slowly began drifting to a stop just to the port side of the heavily damaged Fearless. In the meantime, K-6 turned slightly starboard to pull safely clear of K-12, which was still attempting to run alongside the 12th Submarine Flotilla. K-12 then circled back to inspect the damage and offer assistance, stopping off of the port bow of K-3. Now, the Fearless, K-4, K-12, K-3, and the sinking K-17 were all clustered together in the waters off of the Isle of May, with sirens blaring and lights shining bright in the mist like beacons. If the U-boat appeared now, there was no telling how many British sailors would be slaughtered. Attention was now turned to the sinking submarine. While the watertight doors of K-17 had been closed to prevent further flooding, she had taken on far too much seawater and would inevitably sink. The water continued to rise around the 56 evacuees who jumped into the icy ocean, contaminated with black oil from K-17. The lower bow of the Fearless was now only a gaping hole, having been crushed, crumpled, and torn by the impact with K-17, but the watertight doors had been sealed, and she was apparently able to remain buoyant for the time being. Likely attempting to remove itself from the tangle of ships, K-4 turned 90 degrees starboard. Behind this chaos, K-6 was attempting to catch up to the ship ahead of it. During K-3's desperate turn and her own turn to avoid K-12, K-6 had lost sight of K-3's stern light. But now, seeing a light through the mist, the captain ordered the helmsman to follow it, assuming that he had rediscovered K-3. However, as he approached, he ascertained that it was not the stern light of K-3. It was the starboard light of K-4, floating motionless in the water. By the time K-6 made this realization, there was no time for any action.
No.
The bow of K-6 rammed straight into the side of K-4, nearly shearing her in half. Immediately, K-4 began to sink, dragging K-6 down into the ocean with her. Just behind K6 was K7, which was still traveling at significant speed.
Oh
The captain had a
no!
habit of
It's
keeping
like
his
a
ship
50-car
farther behind the
pileup
ship
on the
ahead of it
ocean
than
with
ordered,
warships.
especially aboard
And they
the
all sank.
unmaneuverable K-class
Oh
that he was newly
no!
captaining. As K7 moved through the mist to keep pace with K6, the captain suddenly realized that the ship ahead was completely and inexplicably stationary. He ordered the engines full astern, but it was obvious that this wouldn't be enough to bring her to a stop in time. The helm pulled the nose of K7 to port, with just enough space for the ship to slide alongside K6. As she did so, the bottom of the ship struck the sinking K4, but K4 was sinking so rapidly that she only scraped the top. The captain of K6 ordered the engines full astern in a desperate attempt to pry herself free, and the two halves of K4 tore apart, abruptly releasing K6, which bobbed back up to the surface. Immediately, the crew of K6 trained their lights ahead, looking for survivors, but no movement could be found on the still water. There had been no time for anyone to escape. In the meantime, many of the 56 men of K-17 were struggling to keep their heads above water as the cold stole their strength and they inadvertently gulped down the black oil, while a few still stood on the casing of their sinking submarine. By this point, the boats from the Fearless had all been deployed and were busying themselves finding submariners in the water to pull to warmth and safety. But behind this cluster of ships, there was still one final group leaving the Firth of Forth, the 5th Battle Squadron, with its 3 battleships and its myriad screening destroyers. They had passed well south of the first collision between K-14 and K-22, but even after all this time, only the first warning about the first collision had been transmitted, useless by this point, leaving the massive battleships entirely unaware that the 13th submarine flotilla had even reversed course, and now they were bearing down on the remaining ships of the 2 flotillas at a speed of 21 knots. First, the Barham approached, and it appeared that she would scrape along the port side of K3, but by incredible luck, she managed to squeeze between K3 and K12, avoiding not only the survivors of K17, but all of the ships tangled among one another. But this was not the case for the screening destroyers. Ignorant of the survivors in the water, they chose tracks around the Fearless and the sinking submarine. The rescue boats from the Fearless scattered and dodged out of the way as the destroyers carved their paths straight through the survivors. As the first destroyer passed, she slammed into the men, concussing and battering many of them, while others were sucked into the propellers and torn into pieces. The wash of the Barham swept over the sailors still standing on K-17, pushing them into the water and directly into the path of the remaining destroyers. Following close behind the Barham was the Warspite, which threaded between the ships in exactly the same way that the Barham had, but along with her came further screening destroyers who crushed yet more survivors, and finally, the Valiant passed between them with the last group of destroyers. All 3 battleships have been traveling so precisely that they managed to weave their ships between the submarines without even touching their hulls. The fortune of the battleships was undercut by the deadly courses of the destroyers. As they found new paths, each one struck, drowned, and dismembered even more submariners. This continued until the entire 5th Battle Squadron had passed. After they did, the sailors aboard the Fearless and the other K-class submarines searched for men in the oily, bloody water, but of the 56 who had abandoned K-17, only 10 could be found, one of whom was gravely wounded. After bringing him aboard the Fearless, this wounded man died as well, leaving only 9. At last, the waters were clear and the ships could take inventory. The Fearless herself had been horrifically damaged, but it was clear that she was in no danger of sinking despite the gaping hole in the fore section, and so she began to limp back to Rossett alongside the remaining K-class submarines. Back at the initial collision, K-14 and K-22 were receiving assistance from some of the screening destroyers, and one of them began towing K-14 back to harbor. K-22, on the other hand, was able to travel back on her own power, but her speed was limited by the pressure placed on the door exposed to the water in the fore section. The other ships, still scheduled to meet with the force from Scapa Flow, continued onward into the North Sea, leaving the carnage of the submarine flotillas behind them. After an hour and 15 minutes, the Battle of May Island was finished. Immediately upon the return of the damaged ships, the admirals began communicating, desperate to discover what precisely had happened. Many of the details were muddled and contradictory. Only a few things could be discerned for certain. Of the 9 K-class submarines that had left the Firth of Forth that night, 2 had sunk and 3 had been damaged to varying degrees, a casualty rate of over 50%. The Fearless had suffered crippling damage to her hull, while the Inflexible had lived up to her name and escaped with only scrapes. From the initial impact between K-14 and K-22, 2 men had drowned when water flooded into the living quarters. When K-6 had bisected K-4, every one of the 55 men aboard went down with the ship. And of the 56 who escaped from K-17, 47 of them have been smashed and shredded by the screening destroyers. No survivors were discovered after the event, and the vast majority of the corpses were lost at sea. The final death toll for the Battle of May Island was 104. The admirals agreed. This matter had to be resolved both quickly and discreetly. After only 4 days, the court-martial began to determine who and what precisely was at fault. Despite the overwhelming complexity of the Battle of May Island and the myriad of conflicting reports, a basic timeline of what occurred could be ascertained, though the specific routes of certain ships remained in dispute. In particular, the inciting incident for the entire event was confounding. First, what were the 2 boats that had found themselves in the path of the 13th submarine flotilla, floating in the mist? Nobody with the force leaving Rosyth was informed about other ships scheduled to be in the water, and they were far too small to be enemy vessels. The immediate suspicion was that they were minesweepers, but when the man coordinating the ships at the Isle of May was brought to testify, his statements didn't align with the experiences of the 13th submarine flotilla. He confirmed that, while there were small ships out sweeping for mines at the time, they theoretically wouldn't have crossed paths with the ships from Rosyth. Even more mysterious, however, was the mechanical failure experienced by K-14, namely, the jamming of her helm. While the K-class was prone to sometimes extreme issues related to their construction and maintenance, there had never been a cataloged incident with the helm jamming, and nobody serving aboard the K-class ever made mention of such an incident. A thorough investigation of every mechanism from the helm to the rudder was performed, and yet, every single test came back with the same result. As things were, no cause could be found for the jam, and it could not be replicated. In the end, while a few of the officers were reprimanded, this had little to no effect on their careers, and the reason seemed clear. The event had been so embarrassing for the British Royal Navy that the Admiralty was more interested in hiding it than remedying it. No memorial was to be constructed, and no record was to be made public. To the submariners who partook in the Battle of May Island, the moral was clear. The K-class was far too awkward and unreliable. Communication technology was too rudimentary to properly coordinate with the fleet, and fleet submarines were more of a danger to their own ships than to any enemy. But to the admirals, the problem lay not with the K-class, nor with the concept of fleet submarines, only in their implementation. The performance of these large submarines after the war, however, did not bear out the expectations of the admirals. They never were to encounter the enemy beyond the one fruitless exchange of fire, and after a formal declaration of peace between the belligerents in the Great War, the K-class were assigned to posts around the Atlantic. There, however, they continued to suffer mechanical faults, and dozens of the Grand Fleet's best mariners drowned as K-class continued to sink. Even still, the admirals were keen to make use of this submarine that was meant to be one of the great achievements of the Royal Navy. As such, a few of the K-class were retrofitted to have massive 12-inch guns mounted onto the deck, recategorizing them as the M-class. This extra gun, however, made the already clumsy ships even more unwieldy. On December 12, 1925, M1 dove during an exercise and simply never resurfaced, drowning all 60 men aboard. After so many deaths due to the inadequacy of the submarines, the Royal Navy was finally forced to retire the remaining K-class, sending the majority of them in for scrap. The M-class, however, were retrofitted for new purposes. M2 was outfitted with a hangar to launch a single biplane with folding wings, while M3 was given a mine layer. But these alterations couldn't solve the extant issues with the hull. One day, while out at sea, M2 seemed to disappear entirely. Only hours later, a man aboard a ship who had seen M2 that morning casually asked if it was normal for submarines to dive backwards. He was told that it was not. It took 8 days for the search teams to discover M2 in over 100 feet of water. Her crew had all suffocated in the time it took the salvage crews to find her. It was decided that M3 would not be given the chance to drown her crew as well, and she was scrapped for her metal. The last of the K-class hulls had finally disappeared, and with them, the dream of the fleet submarine. It would be decades until the creation of another submarine that rivaled the size of the K-class, and this time, when they did, they were running under nuclear power, and their implementation would not even slightly resemble that of the K-class. Even after the war, as the files of military operations were made public, those kept about the Battle of May Island remained sealed, and the Royal Navy seemed willing only to acknowledge the most basic facts about it. It wasn't until 1994, 76 years later, that the file was released and the details made public, and in 2002, a memorial was finally constructed in Anstruther Harbor, long after everyone involved had died of old age. Now, every trace of the K-class has either been dismantled or rests on the bottom of the ocean, rusting and decaying, a fate that, to those who served aboard them, would seem only
I must
fitting.
confess, I was not certain you would return. Do not take this as a compliment. Trust not what you see in the mall. Return only if you must. Will that be all, Mo Walker?
This one was so good.
Do not draw the jailer's eye.
contracted
Down the rabbit hole.
When first viewing one of the gameplay demos from Star Citizen, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed. The environments are detailed and beautiful, the flying is satisfying to watch, and the seamless transitions from space to a fully rendered planet are stunning, as is the ability to walk around the ships while they're being flown. A quick glance at the game's website reveals that they have raised almost $130 million and counting, while another section claims that there are numerous A-list actors for it. Searching for information online will generally turn up both zealous support and staunch opposition, along with tepid, dubious interest. These searches will often leave the question largely unanswered. What exactly is Star Citizen? On October 15, 2012, a new game publisher under the name Cloud Imperium Games launched an independent crowdfunding campaign for their first game, entitled Star Citizen, asking for $2 million. The proposed game was to be a space simulation, a genre that had mostly died out around the end of the 90s, set in an open game world. The campaign states that, quote, "It's a complete universe where any number of adventures can take place, allowing players to decide their own game experience. Pick up jobs as a smuggler, pirate, merchant, bounty hunter, or enlist as a pilot, protecting the borders from outside threats." The economy was to be constantly changing in real time, with supply and demand dictating the costs of goods in different parts of the playable universe. Along with the gameplay was promised what they called a Newtonian physics system, in which flying through the vacuum of space is realistically simulated through the use of moving thrusters controlled with a fly-by-wire system, so that if any individual thruster is damaged, movement is appropriately affected. This persistent universe would be paired with a single-player campaign as well. Many of these features were shown in videos of the self-funded prototype build, presenting stunning visuals, animations, and high polygon count models, all presented by the game's producer, Chris Roberts, aided by cheesy green screen effects.
As a wide-eyed 8-year-old, I dreamt of being a hotshot pilot saving the galaxy, a livable road making my way across the cosmos.
Reward tiers included ownership of ships, which would be flyable when the game was finished and publicly available, along with numerous other rewards. At this point, the game's projected release date was 2014. Roberts' presence on the project was a major selling point. He was a prolific and well-known game developer whose career began in the 80s when he worked chiefly as a designer for numerous titles both well-known and obscure, most notably Ultima 5. In 1990, however, he released the game for which he is most known, Wing Commander, for which he served as both producer and lead designer. This game capitalized on the excitement around space combat proliferated by Star Wars, and critics praised it for emulating the feeling of dogfighting in space while still remaining accessible to a new audience. It quickly became a bestseller, and is largely credited with launching the popularity of the space sim genre that would persist throughout the decade. Wing Commander itself received numerous sequels and expansions, which garnered generally positive reviews and made very large returns. Near the end of the decade, however, Roberts gained a reputation for over-promising on his games. This was encapsulated with his game Freelancer, which was touted to have a sprawling multiplayer universe but was subject to numerous delays. Development began in 1997, and when it was first announced in 1999, Roberts declared that the release would occur in fall of 2000, just a year later. However, this date was continually pushed back to the point that the studio ran out of money and was forced to enlist the financial aid of Microsoft. Only in 2003 was the game finally released, 3 years late. Though the game was missing many of the features announced, the critical reception was still positive, and most reviews gave it an 80% or better. After the release of Freelancer, Roberts left the video game scene to produce movies which almost universally received either mixed or negative reviews and either made little money or lost money, including Lord of War and Lucky Number 11. Despite Roberts' limited success over the previous decade, many nostalgic fans reacted with excitement to see the name behind Wing Commander attached to a new project. Within a day of the crowdfunding campaign going live, they had raised over $650,000 from nearly 7,000 backers, averaging almost $100 per backer if the numbers on the site were accurate. However, Cloud Imperium was not expecting such a massive rush of visitors, and the site promptly crashed after a day. And so, a backup plan was instituted.
I think this is a little harder than I first thought. We were completely overwhelmed by the amazing response we got when we announced Star Citizen. But unfortunately, our servers were even more overwhelmed than we were and went down for a few days. So we're just at the tail end of getting it all back into order. But in the meantime, the kind folks at Kickstarter have offered to help out, and we'll be launching a Star Citizen Kickstarter page.
On the Kickstarter page, they added a number of reward tiers. To receive a copy of the game, the backer only had to commit $30, but some of the tiers were exorbitantly expensive, with the highest being $10,000. The 2 million goal was met quickly, and so additional stretch goals were added, including extra ships and star systems. During this time, media outlets were discovering Star Citizen as well, and they began running articles on it, increasing its exposure. By the time the campaign was finished a month later, the total raised just exceeded $5.5 million, donated by almost 80,000 backers.
You have my attention,
This income fueled
Maw
even
Walker.
further media attention, and it served as a success story for this relatively new method of gathering funds. Due to the publicity it was receiving, Cloud Imperium decided to leave the donations open to continue raising money, appropriately adding stretch goals as more money was raised. But after the hype had died down, the company continued to receive between $5,000 and $10,000 a day from new backers and those pledging for extra packages.
So nice to see you.
During this time, Cloud Imperium expanded production, working out of 2 different offices in 2 different locations, both
What
in
is
America.
my task?
The smaller and
Praxis's
quainter
will
one was
be
in
done.
Austin, where the team began work in January of 2013. The other was in Los Angeles, into which the rest of the crew moved in April. Throughout the rest of the year, regular updates with steady progress were posted through the website and through their YouTube channel, with videos on ship designs as well as interviews with developers. On August 24th, 2013, these updates culminated in the first module released for Star Citizen, the Hangar module, which was revealed at Gamescom in Germany.
Oh, come on.
Only 2 months later, a large convention specifically for the Star Citizen project, aptly named CitizenCon, was held to show even more progress, including planetside environments, along with other footage from the 2 separate studios under the Cloud Imperium banner. However, with this celebration came some worrying news. On December 16, 2013, Chris Roberts released a public letter stating that the game's dogfighting module would be delayed indefinitely. We had 2 choices, he explained in a letter to the public. Either fork development and spend time building something that would involve throwing away work in order to meet the December deadline and deliver something that wouldn't have the level of polish
Even
I'm
in
happy with,
death we must
or
fight.
stay on course to build something that would lead directly into the finished game. Though funding had already been steadily increasing over the course of 2013, the release of the Hangar module would catapult the funding past $35 million by the end of the year, with the company having grown to a total of 48 employees, with another 91 contracted from other companies.
brought us here.
Turbulent was hired to help design web tools such as the Star Map, and Ilphonic was hired to create the first-person shooter module entitled Star Marine. At this point, Ilphonic had not yet released their infamous game, Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. With the game's release date less than a year away, backer money continued to flood in, and in January of 2014, a new office was opened in Manchester, England, specifically to work on the single-player campaign, Squadron 42, while the other offices quietly continued on their work through to the next year. However, the scope of the game had increased immensely, with more ships, more features, and more occupations being announced as more money was received. Many accused Chris Roberts and his team of feature creep, a phenomenon wherein a project's scope becomes far more than ever can be delivered. The difference here, however, was the project's budget was continually fluctuating, and as it grew, the ever-ambitious Roberts saw the possibility to create something even bigger and better, but it was taking time to build his team. As 2014 began, updates became vaguer and less frequent. Video of ships in production seemed to slow to a crawl, and the most revealing show on their YouTube channel became the 10 for the Chairman series, where Chris Roberts would answer questions sent by subscribers who were paying extra money for more detailed updates on the game. These 10 questions, however, were not often accompanied by any images or video footage of game assets, and left the audience largely disconcerted. Much had been promised in the stretch goals, and suddenly, progress seemed to be slowing. On June 3rd of 2014, the Arena Commander dogfighting module was launched to much fanfare. Playing in a local lobby seemed mostly smooth, if not buggy, but the performance with other players on Cloud Imperium's servers would chug even with low graphical settings, leaving most players feeling unsatisfied and frustrated. After the release of the dogfighting module, Cloud Imperium again went mostly silent. Small incremental updates were released for Arena Commander, including a racing mode, and more ships were added over time. During the next Gamescom in August, there was even more disappointment. The multi-crew ships were buggy with low frame rates, and the game crashed near the end of the presentation. CitizenCon was similarly disappointing. Even the announcement and a demonstration of the first-person shooter module, Star Marine, did little to assuage the concerns of onlookers. A large number of fans remained hopeful, but critics began slamming the game. Some saw the delays as a way to make the best game possible, but others began to see the game as a scam. Most online publications were tentative to state anything too positive, and the closest that any article came to positivity was neutrality. The communities quickly began to split, with fans of the game in some sections of the internet and detractors in others, occasionally butting heads in the comment sections of videos and articles in discussions that almost always spiraled into brutal arguments. Despite the enthusiasm from the former party, much of the community's interest and faith now hinged on Star Marine's launch, slated for April of the following year. To make matters worse for Cloud Imperium, two games were beginning to muscle into Star Citizen's arena that year, Elite Dangerous and No Man's Sky. The former had launched its crowdfunding campaign during Star Citizens, with a similar feature list, and though it was also receiving delays, this project seemed to be far more on track. The latter, a space game focused on exploration, had just been announced the previous year and received massive amounts of positive attention at the 2013 VGX Awards for its vibrant color palette and scope of its gameplay, as well as the ability to land on massive, lush, procedurally generated planets. All of this was occurring around the time that faith in crowdfunding projects was beginning to dwindle, especially crowdfunded games. In 2012, the Yogscast channel on YouTube had successfully crowdfunded almost $570,000 for their game, Yog Ventures, to be released in December of that year. However, after numerous delays, they announced the project canceled in July of 2014, with no recourse for the backers who had lost their money. This occurred to Code Hero as well, a campaign in 2012, a release date that same year, and delays until 2014 before it was finally canceled. This pattern was cropping up more and more to the point that clickbait lists were being written about them, and it seemed that Star Citizen would inevitably follow the same route. However, some believed that it had the hype to continue receiving money so that it would remain in development hell indefinitely. David Piner of 10 Ton Hammer writes in an opinion column that, quote, "It's so hilariously transparent that this isn't about making a game anymore, but more so about exploiting a community of zealous fans who will spend as much money as humanly possible to make sure that they're right." He goes on to postulate that
A
what's
drop
going to happen
page
is the game is going
remains,
to drag
but
along
he
as
does
long as
not.
humanly possible, and they're
Where
going to delay
have
that
you
point where you
gone,
can get a
Fate
full and
Scribe?
accurate feel of the various spaceships and
We
the actual
must
combat.
find the
Despite
Fate
these
Scribe.
misgivings,
I will
attacks,
meet you in
bad
the
omens,
ruins.
and lack of updates,
Thank
the
you for
controversy had
assisting
helped
my
generate
search.
awareness for the game, and money continued to pour in. To help promote growth, Cloud Imperium Games began holding what they called
I
concept
would
sales,
assist you,
with detailed descriptions and
combat
concept
is
drawings
not
of ships
my
so that backers
expertise.
could pledge money to receive them upon release of the game.
Yes,
Despite Star
mortal?
Citizen's tarnished reputation, the total amount of money raised had nearly doubled from 35 million to over 68 million, while the number of full-time employees had grown from 48 to over 161, not including contractors. This, however, was not the worst press that Star Citizen would receive. As Star Citizen's funding grew, their public opinion worsened. Predictably, Star Marine was not launched in April of 2015, but unlike the dogfighting module, Star Marine as it was made by IllFonic Studios would never make it into the game. Cloud Imperium had decided early on to use the Cry engine as a base, but would heavily modify it. Due to a lack of communication between the game studios, IllFonic created a version of the first-person shooter module that couldn't be used for Star Citizen's heavily modified engine, and Cloud Imperium made the decision to scrap all of the work that IllFonic had done, deciding instead to redo the code. The map assets that IllFonic designed had to be scrapped as well, because they had been built to the wrong scale, another casualty of poor communication. These, along with a myriad other issues, caused a mutual antagonistic split, and Cloud Imperium Games chose instead to create the first-person shooter module themselves, from scratch. To ease the burden, Cloud Imperium launched a fourth studio, this one in Frankfurt, Germany, to assist with back-end coding. None of these dealings were communicated with the community, however, and after months of saying that the module was almost ready, the studio went completely mum on the topic. Many of the backers were looking forward to the first-person shooting element even more than the flying, and frustration within the community was beginning to increase. A company that had once been incredibly transparent was suddenly beginning to close the blinds, and this did little to settle the concern over an already troubled game. The prodigious amount of money that was being generated meant that, if Star Citizen did collapse, the effect would be much greater than any other crowdfunding campaign's failure, and lawsuits would be almost inevitable. This frustration was compounded by the fact that the aforementioned Elite Dangerous had already launched to generally positive reviews, despite a number of missing features that would later have to be patched in. The question was, if Elite Dangerous could launch on time with far fewer people, what was happening with Star Citizen? On October 1st, 2015, an article was posted to the escapist online nerd culture magazine entitled "Star Citizen Employees Speak Out on Project Woes." Here, the author states that she had been contacted by 7 ex-employees and 2 current employees, all unnamed, interested in airing their grievances after an